how to tell a story. The humorous story is an American development. Its difference from comic and witty stories. I do not claim that I can tell a story as it ought to be told. I only claim to know how a story ought to be told, for I have been almost daily in the company of the most expert storytellers for many years. There are several kinds of stories, but only one difficult kind, the humorous. I will talk mainly about that one. The humorous story is American. The comic story is English. The witty story is French. The humorous story depends, for its effect upon the manner of the telling. The comic story and the witty story upon the matter. The humorous story may be spun out to great length, and may wander around as much as it pleases, and arrive nowhere in particular. But the comic and witty stories must be brief and end with a point. The humorous story bubbles gently along, the others burst. The humorous story is strictly a work of art, high and delicate art, and only an artist can tell it. But no art is necessary in the telling of the comic and the witty story. Anybody can do it. The art of telling a humorous story, understand, I mean by word of mouth, not print, was created in America and has remained at home. The humorous story is told gravely. The teller does his best to conceal the fact that he even dimly suspects that there's anything funny about it. But the teller of the comic story tells you beforehand that it is one of the funniest things he's ever heard, then tells it with eager delight, and is the first person to laugh when he gets through. And sometimes, if he has had good success, he is so glad and happy that he will repeat the nub of it and glance around from face to face, collecting applause, and then repeat it again. It is a pathetic thing to see. Very often, of course, the rambling and disjointed humorous story finishes with a nub, point, snapper, or whatever you like to call it. The listener must be alert, for in many cases the teller will divert attention from that nub by dropping it in a carefully casual and indifferent way, with the pretense that he does not know it is a nub. Artemus Ward used that trick a good deal. Then, when the belated audience presently caught the joke, he would look up with innocent surprise, as if wondering what they had found to laugh at. Dan Setchell used it before him, Nye and Riley, and others use it today. But the teller of the comic story does not slur the nub. He shouts it at you every time. And when he prints it in England, France, Germany, and Italy, he italicizes it, puts some whooping exclamation points after it, and sometimes explains it in a parentheses, all of which is very depressing and makes one want to renounce joking and lead a better life. Let me set down an instance of the comic method using an anecdote, which has been popular all over the world for 12 or 1500 years. The teller tells it this way. And well, before we get into the wounded soldier portion of this, one of the things in the Islamic vision is that lying is not acceptable even to make a joke. So, the wounded soldier. In the course of a certain battle, a soldier whose leg has been shot off appealed to another soldier who was hurrying by to carry him to the rear, informing him at the same time of the loss which he had sustained, whereupon the generous son of Mars, shouldering the unfortunate, proceeded to carry out his desire. The bullets and cannonballs were flying in all directions, and presently one of the latter took the wounded man's head off, without, however, his deliverer being aware of it. In no long time, he was hailed by an officer, who said, "Where are you going with that carcass?" "To the rear, sir. He's lost his leg." "His leg, forsooth?" responded the astonished officer. "You mean his head, you booby." Whereupon the soldier dispossessed himself of his burden and stood looking down upon it in great perplexity. At length he said, "It is true, sir, just as you have said." Then after a pause he added, "But he told me it was his leg." Here the narrator burst into explosion after explosion of thunderous hoarse laughter repeating that nub from time to time through his gaspings and shriekings and suffocatings. It takes only a minute and a half to tell that in its comic story form, and it isn't worth the telling. After all, put in the humorous story form, it takes 10 minutes and is about the funniest thing I have ever listened to, as James Whitcomb Riley tells it. He tells it in the character of a dull-witted old farmer who thinks he has just heard it for the first time, thinks it is unspeakably funny, and is trying to repeat it to a neighbor. But he can't remember it, so he gets all mixed up and wanders helplessly round and round, putting in tedious details that don't belong in the tale and only retarded, taking them out conscientiously, and putting in others that are just as useless, making minor mistakes now and then, and stopping to correct them and explain how he came to make them, remembering things which he forgot to put in their proper place, and going back to put them in there, stopping his narrative a good while in order to try to recall the name of the soldier that was hurt, and finally remembering that the soldier's name was not mentioned, and remarking placidly that the name is of no real importance anyway. Better, of course, if one knew it, but not essential after all, and so on, and so on, and so on. The teller's innocent and happy and pleased with himself, and it has to stop every little while to hold himself in and keep from laughing outright, and does hold in, but his body quakes in a jelly-like way with interior chuckles, and at the end of the 10 minutes, the audience have laughed until they are exhausted, and the tears are running down their faces. The simplicity and innocence and sincerity and unconsciousness of the old farmer are perfectly simulated, and the result is a performance which is thoroughly charming and delicious. This is art, and fine and beautiful, and only a master can compass it, and the machine could tell the other story. To string incongruities and absurdities together in a wandering and sometimes purposeless way, and seem innocently unaware that they are absurdities, is the basis of the American art. If my position is correct, another feature is the slurring of the point. A third is the dropping of a studied remark, apparently without the knowing it, as if it one were thinking out loud. The fourth and last is the pause. Artemus Ward dealt in numbers 3 and 4 a good deal. He would begin to tell, with great animation, something which he seemed to think was wonderful, then lose confidence, and after apparently absent-minded pause, add an incongruous remark in a soliloquizing way. And that was the remark intended to explode the mind, and it did. For instance, he would say eagerly, excitedly, "I once knew a man in New Zealand who hadn't a tooth in his head." Here his animation would die out, a silent reflective pause would follow, and then he would say dreamily, as if to himself, "And yet that man could beat a drum better than any man I ever saw." The pause is an exceedingly important feature in any kind of story, and frequently recurring as a feature too. It is a dainty thing and delicate, and also uncertain and treacherous, for it must be exactly the right length, no more and no less, or it fails of its purpose, and makes trouble. If the pause is too short, the impressive point is past, and the audience have had time to divine that a surprise is intended, and then you can't surprise them, of course, on the platform. I used to tell a Negro ghost story that had a pause in front of the snapper on the end, and the pause was the most important thing in the whole story. If I got it right, the length precisely, I could spring the finishing ejaculation with effect enough to make some impressionable girl deliver a startled yelp and jump out of her seat. And that was what I call after. The story was called The Golden Arm, and I was told in this fashion, you can practice it with yourself, and mind you look out for the pause and get it right. And, well, the word for blurt out kind of doesn't it's used differently mostly nowadays, and particularly in that context, that would people are gonna maybe take issue. But no, you just they don't expect you to raise your voice and all that. But I don't know the difference. Well, I guess back in the day there was a difference between white culture and black culture. There really isn't nowadays. I mean, as far as somebody's a different color, so you expect them, different nationality and stuff maybe. But one of the things I'm reminded of is I had a door knocker, to be out this time of year. And it'd be like, I got a bone to pick with you. I can't feel my legs. And, would have these eyes that light up red. And it's pretty cool until one Thanksgiving, I didn't feel like getting up and somebody stole my door knocker. I think it was a drunk neighbor. Given that it was Thanksgiving, it wasn't the easiest to figure out which drunk neighbor it was. Which is not right. Don't steal what you don't need, and don't take stuff from people who haven't, Of course, the law is that, somebody takes, well, you don't know. If someone takes your lawnmower and you see that same lawnmower in somebody's yard, that might not be the same lawnmower. It may just look like it. But as far as, it's not the body or the dead person that talks to you, but there are spirits that connect to dead bodies, and they will communicate something. So there are cases where the phantom limb or whatever phenomenon extends beyond the grave. The golden arm. Once upon a time, there was a monstrous, mean old man, and he lived way out in the prairie, all alone by himself. Seppin he had a wife, and bimeby she died, and he tuck and totted her way out in prairie and buried her. Well, she had a golden arm, all solid gold, from the shoulder down. He was powerful, and that night he couldn't sleep, 'cause he want that golden arm so bad. And when it come midnight, he couldn't stand it no mo'. So he get up, he did, and tuck his lantern and shoved out through the storm and dug her up and got the golden arm. And he bent his head down again the wind and plowed and plowed and plowed through the snow. Then all on a sudden he stop, make a considerable pause here, and look startled and take a listening attitude, and say, "Ma lan, what's that?" And he listened, and the wind say, "Set your teeth together and imitate the wailing and wheezing sing-song of the wind. Bzzz. And then way back yonder, what grave is?" He hear a voice, all mixed up in the wind, can't hardly tell, and part. Buzz, who got my golden arm? You must begin to shiver violently now. And he begin to shiver and shake and say, oh my lan, and the wind blow the lantern out, and the snow and sleet blow in his face and must choke him, and he start a plowing knee deep towards home, moss dead. He so scared, and pooty soon he heard the voice again, and pause. It us comin' after him, buzz, zzz, zzz. Who got my golden arm? When he get to the pasture, he hear it again, closer now, and a comin' back, da in the dark in the storm, repeat the wind and the voice. When he get to the house, he rush upstairs and jump into bed and kiver up head and ears and lay da shiverin' and shakin' and then way out da he hear it again and comin' and bimeby he hear pause odd listening altitude pat 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 hits a comin' upstairs, then he hears the latch and he knows it's in the room. Then pooty soon he know it's a standin' by the bed, pause. Then he know it's a bendin' down over him. And he can't scarcely get his breath. Then he seemed to feel something cold right down most again his head. And then he pauses. Then the voice say, right at his ear, who got my golden arm? You must wail it out very plaintively and accusingly. Then you stare steadily and impressively into the face of the farthest gone auditor, a girl preferably, and let that awe-inspiring pause build to and within itself in the deep hush, and when it has reached exactly the right length, jump suddenly at the girl and yell, you've got it. If you got the pause right, she'll fetch a dear little yelp and spring right out of her shoes. But you must get the pause right, and you will find it the most troublesome and aggravating and uncertain thing you ever undertook. And H.P. Lovecraft does this too, but back before radio and even TV, before TV and largely even radio, I guess the people left and right couldn't talk right, so maybe you would have to tell the stories differently for people who weren't literate. So they wanted to have something available for those people. But if you correct the English and all that sort of stuff, that would help facilitate people being better at speaking, right?